So I need to know a little bit about you before we go. So I'm sorry if this is embarrassing, but I need to know kind of what JavaScript frameworks you have familiarity with so that I can contextualize. I'm not going to compare everything to Knockout if nobody here has ever used Knockout. So if you wouldn't mind sneaking up your hand, I'm just going to say a couple frameworks I'd like to hear about it. So if you have a good amount of experience with Angular, put out your hand up. Okay. React. Ember. Okay. Vue.JS. I should ask that. Okay, cool. Got my guy in the back corner. Writing significant SPAs or stuff like that with vanilla JavaScript. Okay. All right. There's one other. Did I say Knockout already? Did I ask about Knockout? Okay, Knockout. Anybody? Okay, cool. You aged yourselves about how long you've been writing JavaScript by your response to those, but that's cool. So Vue.js is a JavaScript framework, and it is related to all. Oh, I'm sorry, jQuery. Okay, cool. I assume that was like my baseline, so I'm going to work from there. So it is related to all of those in various ways. It's probably least connected to Ember. It's most notably connected to Angular because the guy who wrote it used to work at Google and he was around the same time Angular was being developed. But he didn't work on the Angular team. It has a lot of similarities to Angular, and we'll learn about all these as we see it, and that there's a lot of the definition that happens in the actual like HTML. Like if you're used to seeing things in Angular where you're defining a for loop on the element that is iterated over, we have that here. So if you've done Angular, you're going to see a lot of familiarity. We'll talk about the comparisons between these, but it's also similar to React in a lot of ways. These reactive components that are composed together and all this kind of stuff. But it's also extremely light. You only need to pull in a single line, pulling it down from a CDN, and you can start writing that code. So it's very similar to jQuery and very different from React in that way. So there's a lot of these ways you're going to see overlaps. Hopefully you'll find some familiarity between them. Stop me, ask questions at any point. Like I said, this will all go online later, so if we only catch the first half of this talk, it doesn't matter. The slides are good enough. It's extremely small. It's very isolated, so the router is separate. The HTTP client was separate, and then Axios came along, and so they're just like, oh, Axios is better than our HTTP client, we'll just delete ours. Like, it's very, very much, you're just supposed to be composing these together. They all play together nicely, but the core has very little going on, so it's extremely light, extremely fast, extremely flexible. So let's compare it a little bit against some of these other ones. So jQuery isn't even a framework. We don't even need to worry about that. It's a library that makes it really easy for you to do a couple things like accessing the DOM and getting over cross-browser issues. So not a big deal. If you've used Knockout before, it's going to be most similar to you because Knockout was extremely light and it made it very simple for you to just bind little tiny pieces of your page, tiny little components, little widgets, and do JavaScript-y stuff and reactivity on those, and then not touch the rest of the page. Very much like Knockout, be very familiar to you. Angular is this big, heavy behemoth. It is clumsy, it forces you into its way of thinking, and if you don't want to think the way it wants to think, everything's going to break. And even if you do get around it, the next time they put out a new release, it'll break everything. This is much lighter, much more flexible. You don't have to do SPAs. It works really well with widgets components. Very different from it in that way. It's very similar to React, but it's a lot faster. And React is supposed to be the fastest thing ever. And the React team agrees it's faster, and they have a great working relationship with React. It's faster than that. The tooling is a lot simpler. You literally can have, include this and then a couple lines of script, and that's it. So you don't need to know Webpack. You don't need to have 15 builds tools. And you can if you want, but you don't have to. But it also prefers HTML and CSS, much like Angular, instead of JSX, JavaScript templates. And that's a big kind of style change. So if you love JSX, you can do JSX in Vue, but you don't have to. And Ember is really made, like Angular, Ember's opinionated, but it's a little bit less opinionated. But Ember is opinionated towards SPAs. And if you're not familiar, SPA means a single page app. So you load the page once, you never load to a different URL, and the JavaScript framework handles all your navigation, your components, all that kind of stuff. Vue is not that way. Vue works anywhere from the tiniest little widget up to full SPAs. Ember just wants to own everything. And if it doesn't, it's not really a good fit. So that's kind of where they're a little bit different from each other. They did an internal comparison with all the major frameworks that you can go here, get the notes later, I'll show them to you. And they actually work with the people from the other frameworks. And we said, we want to make sure that we represent your framework well versus as a straw man. Can we kind of do this thing together? And they're like, yeah, cool. So they were working with the React team to make sure that they were doing a good example that showed what's good about React, and it still looked better in those contexts. But they wanted to work together to make sure they weren't just kind of faking these folks out for all this kind of stuff. So let's take a little bit of a look at its syntax. So this is the simplest possible use case for Vue. So the first thing we do is define an actual, this is actually on a page, this is not a JavaScript file, and ID equals app. This is how we're identifying the container within which we're going to be binding our Vue instance. So anything out of this won't be touched by Vue at all. And in that, you can see we got a template. Then we pull in Vue.js. We actually are pulling it in from a CDN. We're no build steps or anything like that. And then we instantiate an instance of Vue. So we define for this instance of Vue that our element is app. And so if you do jQuery, you're familiar with this hash app, identifies the thing with ID of app. And then we send it some data with a message of hello world. So Vue reads that. It says, well, you didn't pass me a template when you initialized it. So I'm going to go read my element for a template. Oh, look, there's a template. Looks like handlebars or mustache. I know how to read that. I'm going to pass the message property there. And that's it. And now you have a page that just has the div with ID of app with the word hello world inside of it. And that's it. You're done. You wrote your first Vue app ever. Nothing else but this in an HTML page. And this is actually, when you do like the base generated Vue instance, it looks exactly like this. I mean, not these same words, but basically the same kind of thing. So like I said, we created a Vue instance. It's bound to a div with an ID of app. It interprets the contents of that div as a template, and then it reads that mustache style syntax, and it echoes out the contents of the message variable in line. So if you're not familiar with reactive data, it basically just means the relation. It's the relationship between the data that is in memory in your JavaScript and the DOM. They're basically talking to each other. And you've heard of data binding before. It really just means they're kind of connected, and it's taking the responsibility for syncing them between each other. One-way data binding means it only goes from your JavaScript to your DOM. Two-way means a change made in either place updates the other. So two-way data binding means if you update a text field, it'll also then update it inline. React is all about one-way data binding. Angular is all about two-way data binding. Vue kind of lets you make your choice, and so we'll look a little bit more into that a little bit. So the data in that previous example we looked at is already inherently reactive. And so if we had that exact same thing we did, but notice right here, when we said new view, we just said new view. We haven't assigned that to something, so if they go in the browser, they can't actually change it. But let's say we said var VM, sorry about that, var VM equals new view. Now we have a way to reference that instance of view. And so in your console or in another script, you can literally access your data properties just by, this is a convenience thing, but vm.message equals something else. And the moment you change that, it will realize that they're out of sync. And just like React, we've got a virtual DOM, and so it's able to very, very quickly render the changes or diff the changes and then render it out. So this reactive, it's the changes we make in one place are pushed through to the other place. If you want to do two-way data binding, there's something called vmodel. And this is where it's going to start looking more like Angular. You're seeing we're going to have these v-whatever properties in our actual templates that are going to send definitions to our code about what it's supposed to be doing. And so the vmodel says should be two-way data bound with this particular property in my data object. So vmodel equals message says two-way data bind this thing, its value, together with the message property. And so as you can see here, we have message referenced twice. Once we're just spitting it out after messages, and once we're two-way data binding it together with that input. And look, this is still all we've ever written. The only thing I've deleted here is I've stopped showing you the link to the CDN hosted version of Vue, because you know that's there. And then you get this. So you have two-way data binding, instant, super fast, just working right away. He got it. So what are our various options for templating? There's a couple different things you can do, and you're going to hear me say this over and over again. With Vue, you get to choose how you want to work with it. Sometimes when people say, oh, it's totally flexible, build your own thing, it means it's awful and exhausting, and you never know which one to pick, and every single time you make a new project, you're having to plug together 20 different systems. I hate it when people do that. That was Backbone. I hate Backbone. Did anybody use Backbone? Backbone's awful because it makes you make every single choice every time. Vue is fantastic because it has all the defaults that you can then change. That's the difference here. So mustache is probably how you're going to be working. But if you want, you can very easily, and you can find examples of this online, use JSX in your Vue instead. So mustache makes it really easy to echo something out. We saw earlier that vmodel does two-way data binding. So the one-way data binding, so you're not making changes in the DOM, is using v-bind. So if you say v-bind : property name, then it is now going to pull super ID from your data and set the ID on this div to be the value of super ID. So if I had a data property named super ID that was set to 50, and then I did this would say div ID equals 50. Okay, so that's how we bind properties. And then anywhere that we're doing any of this stuff, whether it's in the vbind or whether it's in the mustache templates, we can do expressions. And so we can start doing, if you've ever used something like Twig in PHP or something like that, you're probably familiar with this, or handlebars in some ways, of anytime you're echoing something out, you can also do these really simple expressions. You can't do if or whatever, but you can do these ternary expressions. So you can say, well, if signed up is true, then hit cancel. And if sign up is not true, then hit sign up. And so you can start doing these little things in here. But the interesting thing is you can also do those expressions based on the relationship to these data properties, which can change. And so all of a sudden, when you change that one data property, whether it's the message or some Boolean or something like that in your data property, your UI changes the moment you toggle that from true to false. And so all of a sudden, this reactivity starts being more than just words in a box somewhere, and your actual UI is changing in more and more complex ways in response to the state of your data. So here you can see we're binding the disabled flag on this thing based on whether or not the status property is set to published. And so now we can start building out these UI elements based on the status of our various data. And additionally, there's filters, which again, if you've ever used handlebars or Twig or anything like that, you're used to, where you pipe filter after filter after filter after filter, and once they're all done running, that's what's actually spit out in the end. All right, so there's a few directives. Again, if you've used Angular, you're familiar with these, which is v-something, and this allows you to do special controls other than just sticking data in there. And this is usually where the logic comes to play. So for example, v-if equals, remember everything within those quotes is an expression. So this is assuming there's a data property named message, and then it's going to evaluate it for truthiness. And if it's truthy, then this message shows up in the DOM. And if it's falsy, then this message doesn't show up in the DOM. Does that make sense, everyone, what I'm saying? Okay, cool. vShow is exactly the same, but vIf actually changes the DOM. vShow just basically display nuns it. And so the difference between that is if it's something you expect to change, you don't want a whole bunch of DOM thrashing, so you'll use vShow. If it's evaluated once when your template renders and then that's it, just use vIf because you don't have to ever expect it to come back later. And then v4 allows you to iterate over a loop. So you're going to say, for each dog in dogs, do this thing. So if you've got, as you can see in li, you do ul, and then you do li, v4, dog and dogs, do your kind of stuff. So anytime you're doing kind of iterating components, this is what it's going to look like. And then you have access to the dog, and you can say dog.name, dog.color, dog.breed. There's a few other. v-on, which we're going to cover in a little more depth soon, is how we're doing event handling. And the simplest event handling is all the events we're already familiar with, and it's going to be the same syntax you're used to in jQuery. v-on click, v-on mouse out, whatever else ends up being, and there's an expression handled in there, and that expression can be referencing something we'll talk about in a second, which is a method, which is here. You can see it's a method named clickHandler, or you can actually do an expression directly in there. You can say status equals published, or you can say toggled equals false, and so you can actually be doing assignments on your data properties directly in there. You can also do modifiers on your event handlers. So if you do .prevent, that is the same as doing e.prevent default in jQuery or wherever else. So there's little simple modifiers you can add onto your event handlers to modify how it handles those events. And then finally, there's a special bind. We looked at bind v-bind ID before, where we're just binding a string. There's a special bind for classes, and as I'm sure you're aware, if you've ever had to change the class status for something, it can get really complex, because one class should be set to the value of this thing, and another class should be toggled based on this comparison of those two. So you can do them in very complex ways, like in React, where you're actually doing a whole bunch of stuff in JavaScript, and at the end of that logical chain, then make an assignment, you can do that. But this is a shortcut that says, well, the class of class name, or no, how is it? The class of class name should be set whether or not prop is truthy, remember? So this is basically saying, if prop is truthy, then give it the class name prop. If it's not, then don't. And then again, we can do truthy expressions. Give it the other class name class if prop2 equals published. And if it's not, then don't give it that. So we're doing these expressions further and further and further to give ourselves the ability to do the very common tasks of evaluating things without having to always do it all in JavaScript. Little inline things. You can do it in JavaScript if you want, but you don't have to. So a lot of these things, once you get expression to the point where you're like, you know what, doing this inline is just too much. You say, I want to extract it out to a method. It's just like writing backend code. You write it functionally or procedurally, and eventually you go, you know what, this should be a class, this should be a function. Same thing, you extract it out to a method. So it's basically defining a repeated behavior once and giving it a name so you can reproduce it multiple times. So as you can see here, the simplest way to use a method is just to call it like a method. Show thing, and then the parens indicate it's a method, and so it looks in this methods object. And look, there's a method named show thing, and it's a function, and it does that. And as you can see, we're using template literals, and so we have the ability to access this.message, which is the data property message, within that method. So all this thing would do right here is just say thing shown, : hello world. But there's other places we can use methods other than just rendering. So anywhere that an expression is accepted in Vue, and remember, we've already covered a whole bunch of different places that expressions are allowed, you can also use a name of a method instead. So this thing, where is it? This thing right here, we're going to say button v on click equals counter plus plus. That's an expression. Okay, that expression right there says anytime somebody clicks this button, run the expression counter plus plus, which says find the counter property, run plus plus on it. And if you're not familiar with that, that means add 1. So this code right here, no methods, every single time you click on it is automatically going to increment counter, which is fine. That's cool that you can do that inline. But let's say you get to a point where we want to do conditionals. It wants to be minus minus unless we're already at 0, in which case it doesn't do anything or whatever else. Then you extract it to a method. So see where it said v on click equals counter plus plus, it now says v on click equals increment. Hey, look, we've got an increment method. What does it do? This.counter plus plus. Same thing, but we can now build out. We can make it a multi-line method, and we can start doing conditionals or whatever else we want to do in there. We also can, if we want, pass properties to our methods. Now before, notice we just used the word increment, no parens around it, you don't need it. But if you do parens, you can now pass in properties. So let's say we wanted to increment by 2, great. It's now a property in our function down there. If you're used to ES 2015, ES6, whatever you want to call it, you might be wondering why I'm not using the fat arrow syntax. Start by not using it. There's a lot of ways where Vue is very intelligent because of how it hoists this and fat arrow syntax functions. Not fat arrow syntax, whatever they call them. No, anyway. I use PHP a lot, so how they name magical new things is always different. The short functions in the new versions of ES change how this is hoisted, and sometimes it breaks this in Vue, and sometimes it doesn't. So by default, just don't use them until you know Vue better.
I think it's just arrow function too. JavaScript doesn't really judge.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with the fat. Okay. So there's a couple of shortcuts because there's some things that you do so commonly that they want to make it easier, and you can see this is like a recurring theme. Things that we do often, let's make really simple shortcuts. And a lot of times people get mad. So in PHP, I work in this framework called Laravel, where we make things really, really, really simple using stuff where architecture astronauts are like, that's not actually the right way to do it. We're like, okay, well, you can do it your way too, but for the newbies, we want to make it easy for them to learn how to do it. It's the same kind of thing here. You can always do JSX. You can always do incredibly complicated things when you're not binding any of these things on the element themselves. You can always use the full v-on::click if you want, but there are shortcuts to make it easier, either because it's repetitive or because you're new at it. And this is just kind of like a consistent thing here. So event handling, extremely common. So at click equals do thing is the same as v-on::click equals do thing. It's just a little shorthand. Similarly, binding data properties to be used or binding your data to be used as a property is really common. So v-bind::href is the same as :href. So it's just a little shortcut that makes it a little bit easier to do some of those things, but you're going to see those later. All right, next is computer properties. So a lot of times you hear methods and you go, okay, that's really cool. I can make this expression easier, but what I really want to do is decorate a property or something like that. So I'll make a method for it. There's actually something smarter than methods when you're decorating or manipulating or creating properties that are dependent on each other. It's called a computed property. So, I gave myself a nice little thing. They're like decorators with magical listeners built in. Any property based on the content or another. So the big question is, what's the difference between a method and a computed property? Every single time you rerun a method, it's rerun. There's no caching, there's no magic, because it doesn't know all the things that's going on, and Vue is very heavy on speed and caching. So computed properties assume that nothing's going to change, right? They assume, unless you explicitly talk about it, which we'll talk about later, they assume that the whole reason they exist and the only reason they would ever change is based on any of the properties, this data properties that were set in our data object. And so they assume that if those things have not changed, it kind of queues up or caches up which ones do I depend on. And if the ones I depend on haven't changed, then I'm just going to return that same cached response. So computed properties can be much faster because they never have to go reaccess it unless Vue notices that some of their dependencies have changed. Methods get rerun every single time. So with a computed property, you can have a data object like howdy, which is named message. And what if you want to reverse it? Well, you could have a method that reverses it every single time. Or you can have a computed property named message reversed that takes this message and then reverses it. If you've ever looked at the docs, you may notice that some of these are copied directly from the docs, which is why you see at the bottom there. It says to do better example. Just didn't have enough time. So I wanted to write the thing with the examples that I could find available, whether in blog posts or my own stuff or whatever. So speaking of copying from your own projects, half of this stuff is also from my projects. One day. They are get only by default, but like I said, you actually can do setters. And the interesting thing about that is, let's say you really wanted to set it reversed. You had some UI element where they're typing it reversed, but you really wanted to save the non-reversed version. You can, instead of just passing a single function into the computed property, you can set a get and a set key, an object with a get and set key. And now each of those functions get to define how it's get and how it's set. So as you can see here, in the get, we're just concatenating first name and last name. right? And so that's cool. You got a full name property. Well, what if somebody wants to type a full name and you need to set it back? Well, you just set the reverse, right? You split it by space. You have the first array element. You grab the remainder, and then you're done. And so this is allowing us the ability to really make these like not just decorators in the sense of Vue decorators. They're like fully dependent, separate properties, but that are still totally hooked back in the original. To do, make this a real example. See how I write talks? This is how I write talks. The next thing that is interesting, we have cycle hooks on the creation of each component. Now, right now, we haven't looked at component composition and stuff like that. We've just looked at the single kind of core component. These are available in that. Later, when we look at other components, you also see how these are available in our other components. So there's before create and created, which they happen instantly. It's not even available to the DOM. It's not actually run anything. It's just there in JavaScript. Before mounted and mounted, that's when it's actually being attached to the DOM. Updated when there's any change made. Destroyed when it's destroyed. And these are just hooks. If you're familiar with doing hooks in WordPress or jQuery or anything like that, it's just saying, when this thing happens, give me a little function that I get to run, maybe pass a little bit of useful data or not, depending on the hook, and then let me do something. Whether you're going to stop what's going on, or you're going to decorate something, or you're going to run some other callback. One thing that's really common, actually, I think we'll cover that in a second, so we'll look at this. So you create a new Vue instance, you get before create. It starts looking at the data that's available to us, it initializes events, now it says created. And now it's looking about whether it already exists in the DOM or whether it needs to create it in the DOM, and that defines when mounted and before mount is called. And then it's doing all that fun stuff with templates and stuff like that. Finally, when anything's changing, it's before update and updated. And when you're about to destroy it, you get before destroy. It actually does its destruction, and right at the end, right before it just kind of shuts the thing off, you get destroyed. And so you can imagine all the times that might be useful. And one of the most common ones is mounted. It's probably used more than anything because this is the appropriate time to start getting in dependencies. Now, theoretically, with most components, you're getting in your dependencies from your parent. Most of the stuff, there's a single parent element and components that are being composed within, and the parent is responsible for getting the data down to the child components. But that's not always the case. Or maybe you're in the parent, whatever else it ends up being. This allows you to say, right at the first point when it's appropriate for me to start getting data, go out using Axios or whatever else and get some data from somewhere else. Whatever it is, this is a place where you start getting stuff. And the cool thing about this is before it's actually rendering, so you have the ability to start getting this stuff right away. And it's loading at the same time. Before we move on to the next stuff, there's a few caveats with Vue's reactive model. So because it's using plain JavaScript objects, you've noticed everything is very, very, very simple. We're not using classes that we're initializing that have a whole bunch of magic getters and setters. It's using just objects. And because of that, there's a few limitations with what Vue can and can't do to objects if you're manipulating them using native JavaScript. They've been able to do a really good job of watching almost anything you can do to them, but occasionally you run into edge cases. And so one of those edge cases is if you set any props on an instance, so like, you know how I said you can do vm.message and you can change it. Well, let's say you said vm.magic new property that wasn't defined in instantiation. It doesn't know how to track that. It doesn't know that existed, so it's not watching for it. But you can do that. You just have to change a little bit about the way it's done. And the simplest way to do it is view.set the thing, the index of the thing, and then the value. Now, that doesn't allow you to set stuff on the instance itself. But if you have like an array or an object in the instance itself, you can change its properties using this. And so basically, the best way to do this is if you plan on changing the thing after you start it, which you really shouldn't, make sure that the thing you're changing later is already an array or an already index or an object that has been initialized, and then you can use this syntax to make changes to it that Vue can notice. All right, on to components. So we have actually already been looking at Vue components this whole time because your base Vue instance is a Vue component. And interestingly, later we'll actually talk about a command bus that's also just an instance of Vue. So it's more and more, especially in Vue 2, which came out a couple months ago. So just so you know, you may find stuff on the internet that is a little bit out of date, so watch for Vue 2 versus Vue 1. It wasn't a shift like Angular, but there are a few changes. But we can explicitly define something that exists only as a component. It's not its own separate Vue instance that is already binding. It's only meant to be used as a composed component. If you're used to React, this is going to be super familiar. In general, it's just like what Dave was showing us, where there's basically like, well, there's a box within a box within a box within a box within a box. And this box is a grid box, and this box is a column box, and this box is a login button box. It's the same kind of thing. You're just putting components within components with components. And it's everything about how Vue works is really intended for components to talk to each other and inheritance and all that kind of stuff. So right here, we are globally defining a Vue component named to-do-item. It expects a single property to be passed into it that's named to-do, and it has a template defined here. And this is what I was saying earlier. Sometimes you read your templates from the DOM. Most of the time, the template is defined using something like this. So this is just like our div ID equals app, except this is not bound to anything in the DOM anywhere. We have defined this component abstractly, and now it can be used somewhere else if somebody else wants to do it, but it doesn't have to be. Now, in either another template or in our initial DOM element or whatever else it ends up being, we have an ordered list, and it says use the to-do-item component. And so when it sees something there that's not an HTML element like div or li or whatever, it says, oh, that must be a component. And then it goes, looks within its registry for a Vue component named to-do-item. So there's a few things we're doing here. First of all, we're iterating over them. So you can see you can take a single component and use it as the basis for something you're iterating over. So we're saying for every single item in my to-dos list, which we're assuming is coming from somewhere else, create an instance of to-do item. And then additionally, bind the to-do property to something named item. So this is a little bit complex for your first time looking at it. But when we walk through the pieces, so remember, v-bind : something sets that property on the thing. So last time we were looking at it was like the ID attribute. It was just an attribute. But when you do v-bind : something on a component, that is passing that value in as a prop. So the prop, notice there's a prop property and a prop is just a property that's expected to be passed into a component. So we said, okay, you're looking for a to-do property. I got a to-do property. Item. We're like, okay, well, where's item? And then you look back to v4, v4 equals item to-dos. Okay, great. Every single time you get a new one of these, it's going to pull that item that we're iterating over, pass it in as the to-do property. And now this Vue component is going to do its magic. Vue component has a template. It's an li. Within that template, it grabs the text property off of that to-do that's passed in. And now we've got li, whatever the to-do text was, and li. That's it. So this is the simplest possible use case for us building this kind of thing out. You can also, if you want, make a single or a local Vue component that is only usable when you have this actual, as you can see, var to-do item. We've actually set it to be a variable. So only things that have access to the variable and define this as a component have access to it. So the other one we did Vue.component, whatever. This is now available anywhere on that Vue instance. Here, this one is only available in this one single time where in this instance and its components property, we actually bind that to-do item object into something named to-do-item. And notice, to-do item is literally just a JavaScript object. There's nothing fancy here. This is not a new class, and that's how Vue works. It's as simple as possible. But this is the exact same thing, except this one will be usable in all of our Vue components. This will only be usable in this one component where we explicitly bound it. Okay, few caveats. Remember, we had the data property on our base Vue instance, and it was data:object and then message:hello world. That's fine, but when you're going to have multiples of those, the way JavaScript basically passes objects by reference, if you change it in one component, it would change it in all your other components. And so the way to get around that is instead of data returning an object, data returns a function which generates a new instance of an object that has the exact same shape. And all the difference that's going on here is we're returning this. So this would be data:function return message:hello world. The only difference here is every single time you create a new component, it creates a brand new instance of an object shaped like that, not referencing that same object. Again, this is just kind of like a quick move around of how JavaScript works. And then the next thing is if your template is in HTML, there's just a few items that you can't use a component, or places where you can't use a component name. Because if your browser sees something it doesn't recognize in that spot in HTML, it's going to throw it out. So for example, a table cell, if you do tr and then like my magical component that happens to be a td, it's going to throw it out because your browser's like, that can't be in there. The only thing that can validly be within a tr is a th or a td, right? And so it just throws it out. So if you choose to have your templates live in HTML and you do a table, you might have to do this kind of weird syntax where you do td is and then you do the component name. This happens like 0.05% of the time, but just so you don't get burned when you run into it. All right, props, events, and sync. So this is how communication and data moves up and down between components. I actually put this at the end, but I'm going to just tell you up front. Sync was used in version 1. It doesn't exist in version 2. Don't use it. If you see it in a code base, if you see it in a blog post, that means that blog post is out of date. Run away screaming. Props and events are how things should happen. And the primary focus here is because sync was a promise that you can pass this data in, and it's now two-way bound between the parent component and the child component. And so if you say, I'm passing this prop in, like that to-do earlier, into the child component, and then that child component used vmodel, and then allowed that to-do to be modified, it now would have to push it the whole way back up the stack. And that introduced a whole bunch of complexity. People would be confused about why things are changing, and the system got slower and harder to maintain. So in Vue 2, they just said, screw that. We're going to be more like React in this way. You either pass the data down or you bubble an event up. That's it. That's how things change. So sync is gone. And I was mad at first, and now I'm very happy. Oh, look, I have a graphic. So pass props down to the child, emit events up to the parent. Props down, events up. Just remember that, and it'll all basically make sense. Yeah.
So in that way, we have this model that really represents React. does that mean like the Angular-esque, just like two-way data binding everywhere, kind of only exists within components?
Yes.
Cool.
Yep. There should be no two-way data bind. Actually, I don't think you can two-way data bind outside of the local scope of a component. And even that is not really all that common because a lot of people still choose to do it the React style, like on submit or on enter or on blur or whatever else, then do a method. You can do that. I like two-way data binding within a component because it's very, very locally scoped. You know exactly, this is going to modify that, that's going to modify that, and it can't bubble. And that's part of the thing. When you have two-way data binding plus syncing of properties around components, it's this massive web that gets very, very confusing, especially as somebody from some component down the road can all of a sudden be affecting your input. So this, you do have two-way data binding, but it's very closely scoped. Yeah?
Just on events, do they only go up like one parent? I mean,
Well,
like
good
Reactive,
question.
you have kind of like, you go all the way to the top.
Yeah,
And then you
great question. We'll cover it in just a second.
Okay.
Thank you. So if you pass data in a component as a prop, which we've already covered, that's the way you get data from the top down. So the parent component sets that prop on, when it references the child component in its template, it says, and its prop of to-do, or in here, message, should be set to this. Cool. You notice that we have message here. There's no colon in front of it, and I'm passing a string. So that's what I was talking about earlier about the differences between this and Angular 2. When I reference a component and I have a prop named message, I have two ways to pass that prop in. I can either use message equals do it, and I'm just passing a string, just a literal. Or I can say colon message equals something. And remember, colon is a shortcut for vbind colon message. It says, oh, the parent property has a or the parent component has a property named whatever I'm passing in here, get its value. So a parent can both pass in just strings like this, or it can pass in its own properties. And again, that's fine because it's all still only going down. They can go down 20 components on the stack and nothing's going to change, so it's still safe to do that. So that's props. Oh, here we go. See, if you practice these things, you remember when you have slides for them. So this is the difference between message do it and colon message equals banner. So this is saying there's a property in the parent component that's including my component named banner. Send its property down to this message prop. Does that make sense? Cool. Side note, variable casing. You know that notice that some of these times we're doing this very different casings where, I was trying to remember where that to-do item was. There's all these different cases. So there's different ways to do it, but because of HTML, again, it's just because we're using HTML, we're limited to how HTML works. Use kebab case, which is lowercase dashes. Just like snake case, but with dashes instead of underscores. And in JavaScript, you can use like 20 different options. Just use camel case. Just call it a day, make the decision. That's what the official docs do. It's the easiest way to do it. And Vue handles the translation between the different things. So if you've got something in your JavaScript that's camel cased, it looks for the exact same thing, translated lowercase with every capitalization replaced by a dash. Okay, so we're defining a component here named terms of service, and we want to pass the fact that its button was clicked up to its parent. So we're going to start with the simplest possible way to emit these events. We'll get to complexity in a second. Simplest possible way is to emit event named whatever. So you can see button at click equals accept. So that says when this button is clicked, call the accept method. And then our accept method, we're saying this dot emit, and then we're emitting an event. An event is named accept dash terms dash of dash service. So all we've done is emit an event. Now we have to figure out how do we listen to that event. Well, down at the bottom, it's a little small, so I'm really sorry. But basically what you get is we're calling this terms of service component, and then we say v-on colon accept terms of service. This is an event just like click. This is an event just like blur, but it's now your custom event. And just like anything else, you can just have an event listener that you define right in your component right there. So we define your event listener right when we called the terms of service component that said, when this component bubbles up in accept terms of service event, this is what you should do. Well, what you should do, pass it up to my parent component, accept TOS method. Or we could do an expression in there, whatever else you want. And then our parent, you see, we've got an accept TOS method, which now knows that its child has accepted the terms of service, and now it can do whatever it's want. So this is the simplest possible way to do it is within the child, in a method or an expression, you emit a named event, and then when you are actually in your template embedding that component, the child component, you do, you do an actual event listener that defines which method or expression should be called when that event is emitted. Okay, simplest possible way to do it. So there's a few ways to work around that. What if I want data? Second property is a good, safe assumption. You just pass the second property, you pass some data, you either pass an array or you pass an object or whatever else, and then you're good to go. And so now that's passed in as the property, and you can work with it in the parent. You also, if you don't want to go the whole way up to Redux and Vuex, which we'll talk about in a second, you can use a new instance of Vue as a command bus. And if you're not familiar with a command bus, it's a single thing that's responsible for emitting and listening to events. That's it. Or commands, whatever. It's an event bus, I guess. And so you're using that exact same $emit that we saw earlier, but you're also using the thing that v-on is referencing, which is $on. But this is a single JavaScript variable that can be passed anywhere. All your components have access to it. You put it globally or whatever else you want. And so instead of this .emit, accept terms of service, you would have this JavaScript variable just made, maybe name it bus or something like that, and you'd say bus.emit terms of service. This is not scoped because this is a single instance that you're going to pass everywhere to all your components. So at that point, if you say bus.emit ID selected and you pass it the ID of 1, then anywhere else you can say bus.on because it's the same JavaScript variable. So that's the thing about Vue. If you understand how vanilla JavaScript works, it's very easy to reason how to pass things around and what will and will not work because it's trying to rely on native JavaScript as much as possible. So this is a single thing called bus that has an emit and has an on. It's very simple, right? Nothing fancy about this. But if you take that same property, bus, the same variable, and just pass it all around, well then all of its listeners are going to listen to all of its emitters, and all of its emitters are going to trigger all of its listeners. Cool, done. This is a nice, simple way to have a global event bus without going to the complexity that is Redux. And there is a Redux style, sync, don't use it anymore. I didn't talk about this. So there's a Redux style thing called Vuex, or Vuex, or I don't even know how it pronounces it, that is basically like a Vue's take of Redux. Or you can also just use Redux, whatever you want. We have used Redux in Vue, and it felt like a mismatch because Redux is very Reactive and it's very heavy and complex, and in Vue you're kind of like, eh. So Vuex might be worth looking at if you love Redux. Vuex is very, very similar, but it's very Vue themed. But again, it's just a separate thing. You could use Vuex in your React products, or you can use Redux in your Vue products, or you can just use this thing. It's whatever you want. And don't use sync. All right, slots. Fancy templating thing that we haven't covered yet because I didn't know if we were going to get this far, but we did, so go team. We have a child component named myComponent. So everything between this first comment and second comment is the template definition for our child component. We have something here that says slot. This slot doesn't have a name. All it's defining is like, hey, I'm your slot. And then in a parent component includes this myComponent child component, right? And within it, it just passes in, this is some original content. Since we've not named that slot, it's basically like, oh, well, I'm passing in data in between the opening and closing braces of a component, which we've never seen before. I guess that's meant for a slot. And then it looks in the child component and like, hey, do I have a slot with no name? I do? Great. And so this renders to div h2 title of child, and then p, this is some original content. That's how this renders, because it's just passing it directly in. If you've ever worked with modules, especially in like ES 2015, you're used to the fact that you can export a whole bunch of stuff, or you can export default. Most of the time you just see export default and you just import the thing, right? So if you have a module somewhere that's like my awesome header .module or whatever, and then at the bottom it exports an object or exports a function. Somewhere else you say import my awesome header from my awesome header. You're done, because the default is the big chunk. This slot, this unnamed slot, is the same way. But sometimes when you're working with ES 2015 or ES6, you want to have multiple exports. You might have a default and then a couple named ones so that when you're importing it, you might be importing the base one or you might be importing others. If you're not familiar with what I just said, ignore it. This should make sense, but it's a reference that might make sense if you do understand this stuff. So we can have named slots, and you can combine named slots with non-named slots. So notice here, we've got two slots in our child component. We've got a name slot with the name of header, and we've got a non-name slot, which is just kind of the generic body slot. And so when we call it in the parent, we now have two types of data we're going to pass to our child. We pass to our child first the name slot, which is then going to end up being an H1 with here might be a page title. And then in the non-name slot, it's going to go within that main element, and it's going to be a paragraph that says a paragraph for the main content. It's really interesting because we didn't even have to wrap that paragraph with anything. It just kind of like pulls all the name slots out, and then whatever's left gets passed to the base slot. Does this make sense? You guys have any questions about these ones? Yeah.
So a lot of times in React, you would do all these like through props. You would have multiple props for each one of these little areas inside of components.
Yeah.
This would be like your go-to replacement for that pattern.
I mean, we still use props a lot, but the whole benefit of slots is recognizing that lots of times you end up having prop hell. And just like Dave was referencing earlier, you have to build a prop that can do like 15 different things. You're like, this really shouldn't be a prop, and you feel bad. So then somewhere else you assign it to a variable, and you pass that variable in a prop, but you're really just kind of hoisting that complexity somewhere else. This is trying to say, hey, look, variables can be bigger than just a string. You shouldn't have to mush them all in a string. Why don't we allow our variables that we're passing to our child components to be chunks of code? That's it. So it's just a variable, it's just a prop, but it's a prop with convenience around passing template elements versus just data.
And then each one of the like slot header there could have child nodes beneath it,
Yeah.
in that H1, all that stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff ends up being like you'll put a lot of defaults in, and you'll allow yourself to override it, or you cannot override it. It's whatever you want. So, okay, a couple of last things. I showed you the simplest way to do Vue. It's the best way to start because you're not dealing with tooling, you're not dealing with Webpack, your version of NPM isn't out of date, whatever else. There is the ability, complexity, all you want. You can use Webpack and Browserify and all that kind of stuff. And there's a command line tool that makes it really easy to scaffold based on either the pre-built templates. There's two for Webpack. There's Webpack and Webpack Simple, Browserify Simple, or like HTML, which is what I've showed you right now. Or you can create your own templates. So if you were like really excited about, what was that guy called? That like the where the little hat is for like generating your own Yeoman. If you love Yeoman, there's a little built-in Yeoman here, and so you can either use their built-in ones or you can make your own. So if you use this kind of same shape of Vue project all the time, you just when you create it, I think I might have it. No, I didn't. Of course, Vue-CLI space init space your template name space your project name. So if I were to say Vue CLI space init space Webpack space my awesome project, it would create a new directory under the directory I'm in. It would be named my awesome project. It would prompt me with a few things like saying, what's the name of your project? What's your author? Whatever else it ends up being. And then it would scaffold that whole thing out for me. But if instead of one of those pre-built ones, I say Matt Stauffer / my awesome Vue template, it'll look for that up on GitHub. It'll pull it down. It'll be my template. And so it's really easy to scaffold these things out. So if you're getting started with Vue, this is absolutely the place to start. And there's a lot of other interesting things that are great in the docs. There's lots of stuff writing about it, but as I predicted, I'm almost out of time. This is perfect. I'm a little bit over time. We're not going to cover these in depth, but there's a routing library. It's really fantastic. It's extremely light, just as we keep talking about. You make a new instance of the router, you pass as a really simple object. Each of the items of the object is going to be one of your routes. And then you're basically passing it to component, which is basically a controller, because a component can define all this interaction. It's really simple. It's really beautiful. It's a lot of fun to work with. I hate SPAs, and I actually enjoy working with this. If you go to github.com/mattstauffer/suggestive, it's the first time I ever built one of these. So the code's awful because I was just learning, but you can at least see what it looks like. You can see what the syntax looks like. State management, here we go, we're talking about it. If the event bus isn't good enough, you can check out Redux or you can do Vuex. Testing, I haven't covered in depth because I didn't have time. Karma's a recommended one, but just like anything else, if you can do it in React for testing, you can do it in Vue. They all play really nicely together. Use whatever test runner you want, whatever you want. Pre-rendering, so we'll talk about server-side in just a second, but there's something called pre-rendering where it makes it easy to just have a couple of really simple pages that don't need to be reactive, they don't need to be interactive, they just need to basically be the pages on your site that you want to show up for SEO purposes or marketing, whatever. There's this pre-render SPA plugin that is SPA generic. It's not for Vue, but the guy who wrote it happens to be in the Vue core team, so it works very nicely with Vue. And so it's very easy for you to basically point this at a couple of your routes and say the terms of service page, the sales page, the index page, and the whatever else page are static. Nothing should change. Render them out to HTML every single time we do to build, and then put them up and have them served instead of the Vue app. So it's very simple. More complex, if you really need to get it, you can do server-side rendering. It has it built in, just like React does. It's very simple. Express and Node and all this whole world is really great, but if you can avoid it, just avoid it because it's still a pain in the neck. Oh yeah, we got Mixins. So if you ever used Mixins in Ruby or traits in PHP, you're familiar with this concept where you have a thing. It's not a class that you're extending, but it's usually like a grouping of methods or a grouping of methods and properties that you want to kind of like mix into your parent thing. And so you imagine you've got like this one, which is like a created callback, and then like a hello method, and you want to kind of mix it into all the other stuff you're doing. It just kind of mushes them together, like an array merge or something like that. Mixins let you do that. So you basically say Vue extend, and you're defining a Mixins property on your component, and then you pass this little object. It's just a JavaScript object, nothing fancy. You pass it in, and then it mixes them all together at the end. And so that's a really convenient way. If you have like a method you just use in all your components, this is the easiest way to mix it in. It has a single file syntax called Vueify, if you're familiar with this in JSX, whatever. So basically, in this thing, it didn't render right. This export default thing in the middle should have a script block around it. This is my presentation software. But so at the top, we've got a template that defines the HTML template. Below that, we've got a script block that we're exporting out what the Vue component is. And at the bottom, we can do Sass or we can do Jade or whatever else you want. Yeah.
So you're liking this to JSX? Is this the JSX option? Okay.
No, I mean, you don't need a JSX. You literally use JSX.
Cool.
Yeah, no. This, okay.
The syntax, do you find that, do you use this?
This is the only thing I use, yeah. It's brilliant. So, but the thing is, so I work in a PHP framework that has its own build system built in, and they love Vue. So for me, it's really, really easy to like when I hit Laravel new my project and I open up my app.js file, I just say require whatever.vue, and then I type that file, and all my build steps are set up, and all the dependencies are already there. So for me, going from like starting a new project to like writing my first Vueify syntax component is a matter of seconds. And I wrote it up in our blog. So if you just Google like Laravel Vueify, I think, you'll just find it. And it's the simplest thing ever. And I actually, when we're not doing a Laravel project, I still use our build tool elsewhere because it's just so easy. This is beautiful. This is amazing. It's wonderful having everything together in one place, but don't let it trip you up because this could get you overwhelmed with getting your build steps set up right. So only go here once you've found that you're willing to commit to Vue and you've already tried the simpler ways of doing it. But yeah, I love it. Conclusion. There's not actually much of a conclusion. I just feel like you can't end on the last thing you talked about. So Vue is great. I mean, it's really fantastic. And so within my community, it's one of these things where like the guy who wrote the framework that I work in PHP got excited about Vue, and then one of the main teachers in the community got excited about Vue, and so you're like kind of resisting it. You're like, oh, now I'm just going to be bandwagoning. And so I resisted it for a while, and I even like kind of tongue in cheek, I started Twitch streaming myself learning it, and I was like, call it like learning Vue out loud. And it's just brilliant. Like I want to throw away all of our Angular code. I want to throw away, one of my devs writes this tiny little widget in jQuery, and I'm like, it would have been better, cleaner, and faster in Vue. Like rewrite it. It's just like, it's brilliant. And we have a dev on our team who's like, she loves React more than she loves her pets. And like we are like in our community, we're the company that is doing React more than anybody else. And still, I'm like, Vue, you're so like, I would really recommend you try it out. If you haven't seen it from this, I can show you a couple other projects you're using it, but it's just simple, it's light, it's fast, and it just makes sense. That's the biggest thing. Like, especially if you've written any vanilla JavaScript before, it just makes sense with the way you think, and it tries to get out of the way. Angular forces me to think the way it thinks. React forces me to spend 5 days doing build steps and crazy complex infrastructure, and then it's wonderful. Vue works out of the box, works the way I think, and I think it's really great. So that's it.